I'll just start by saying two really important things have happened for eating disorders in the last few months that make a big difference in how I think eating disorders arise. One is, you've probably all heard the results of the ANGI study, and they found 8 particular genes that were more common in people with anorexia. Now, that's the way they've found those, they actually mapped the whole genome of the people with a certain condition, and then they looked for hits. They did 32,000 people, and then they found that 8 genes were more common. But what's interesting is that their specific the genes themselves are really interesting in what pathways they're in. And as we're talking through some of the chemistry I'm going to tell you, you'll see that it makes sense that that's where they are. The other really amazing and wonderful thing for people with eating disorders is that the Heart Foundation last week very quietly announced that they've taken eggs off the bad list and cholesterol is now back in favour. And you can have full cream dairy because, like we always knew, it's good for you. Now, I'm going to talk, I always say to my patients that to get better from an eating disorder, you need to understand the chemistry, because the people who have eating disorders have different chemistry and they're more susceptible to changes in their intake. Not everybody gets an eating disorder. Everybody has friends, people who get eating disorders know friends who did exactly the same thing with their food, but they didn't get the eating disorder. So what we have to try and do is understand why people have developed it from a chemical point of view. You see, there's all different things. Basically, we're looking at a lack of nutrition. Eating disorders are really complex conditions because in all the precipitating factors, we've got medical issues, psychological issues, chemical issues, all sorts of things. Whatever has led to the reduced nutrition then opens up the pathway and the chemistry to the medical side of the eating disorder. So this afternoon we're talking about the medical side, because if we don't get the medical part right, then the brain isn't working for any of the psychological parts. So what happens basically in an eating disorder, there's not enough nutrition, so the body has to adapt. Now, how that works is actually through the thyroid, which is the gland in the neck that controls your metabolism. Now, when you don't have enough food, the body tries to make you cope with less so that you will survive till food improves. So what the thyroid actually does, and like I said, it's all chemistry, takes iodine, turns it into a thing called thyroxine, which then turns into an active molecule to keep your metabolism up. Now, if there's not enough food, it follows another pathway and makes the mirror image. The body's incredibly clever. This is the same process that bears undergo when they go into hibernation. So instead of making the T3, they make reverse T3, which puts you into hibernation and protects you. When we're trying to help people recover, the logical thing is to try to favour this pathway, which needs zinc and selenium. So, looking at that, the foods that are going to help are things that have iodine. Celtic sea salt is actually the healthiest thing in the type of salt in the world. A lot of the foods, you'll see as we talk through this, a lot of the foods that are on the bad list in society as a rule are the ones that are on the good list for people with eating disorders, and this is part of why they've got problems. So we need them to have more salt. Seafood's good, and sushi. It's actually the nori on the outside. Seaweed in all forms. Then zinc is in oysters, pumpkin seeds, and nuts. And selenium is in Brazil nuts. So basically, if your body's gone into hibernation, you've got to eat the same foods bears eat when they wake up from hibernation. And if you think about it, it's basically blueberries, nuts, and salmon. So that's a good start for somebody with an eating disorder. Yeah. A few years ago in North America, there was a drought. And there wasn't much snow in winter, so there weren't so many berries in the spring. And then that year they had more bear attacks, and somebody actually looked at it and they put it down to the fact that their metabolism hadn't reversed properly, so they were all still grumpy. And this is why people with eating disorders are like grumpy bears in caves and don't want to be woken up. Yes. So we have to try and get the food in to reverse the process. This is it. The thyroid is then linked with another organ. I think I took up too much room on this new whiteboard, but that's linked next with the adrenal. Oh.
Just while we're on sushi, Leanne.
Pardon?
While we're on sushi, that reminds me, I meant to say, there's sushi and food over
Oh, right.
the table.
Right.
So just feel free to go and help yourself to
Yeah.
food and coffee and tea
Right.
as it progresses.
So we've got the thyroid, then we've got the adrenal, which is the little gland that sits on top of the kidney. There's one on each side. They're about the size of an almond, but they're incredibly important because that's how your body deals with stress. Physical stress, mental stress. You know, it basically keeps you alive. How meningococcus kills people is it's a very clever bug. It goes straight to the adrenal, you hemorrhage, destroy the adrenal, and then your body can't respond. And so with the eating disorder, the adrenal is also slowed down. Now what you've got, the center of the adrenal produces adrenaline and noradrenaline. The next layer gives cortisol, which is the one that keeps your blood pressure up, temperature up, pulse up, and sugar up. Which, if any of you have sort of looked at what the doctors check when you go and see them, that's exactly. They're the things that put people with eating disorders in hospital. They can't keep their blood pressure up, can't keep their temperature up. Pulse gets really slow and their blood sugars drop. And the outer layer of the adrenal is aldosterone, which looks after your salt and fluid balance. Now, the thing about the cells that produce aldosterone, because cortisol keeps you alive, they're actually able to mutate to make cortisol. So when people have been sick for a long time, they often crave salt. And that's because they're losing a lot of salt, because they've actually sacrificed their aldosterone to keep producing cortisol. So salt's another thing that is useful. And people crave it. They know how much they need. And then linked with all this, so you've got the thyroid, the adrenal, all communicating with the brain, which is looking after it all. Then the ovaries shut down to protect the eggs. Yeah. A lot of girls don't realise that girls are actually born with every egg they're ever going to have. Males keep making sperm right through life. Although as they get older, then because they've been through more mitosis, they're actually not as healthy. But the eggs are actually present at birth in dormancy and then have to wake up at puberty and then have to survive the whole time. So any damage to the eggs is lifelong. So we have to get the eggs out of hibernation while they're still alive. And so if we don't have enough nutrition for that, then somebody who's recovered will actually go straight to menopause rather than getting their periods back. So it's really important we try to look after the ovaries. The body does it for most people because that's its mission. It wants the person to survive, to reproduce. So, almost always we can get them back, but, there's got to be enough baseline nutrition for that to happen. So what we're looking at is basically somebody who's gone into hibernation like a bear because they haven't got the right nutrition. And we'll just talk about what is the right nutrition. At the beginning I said the other thing that's really important is that at last people aren't being told that you can have full cream dairy again. And that is because cholesterol is so important to us. And what they didn't realise when they brought out all the guidelines, and they were looking at the people with heart disease who made too much. But they forgot that it's the only source of the ring you need to make all your hormones. To make your bile salts for digestion, to make your cortisol. So the adrenal can't make the cortisol if you don't have enough cholesterol. To make all your cell membranes. To make your nerve sheaths. So that's the coating on the nerve to make sure the message gets all the way from the brain to the tip of your toes. And it makes your vitamin D, which is the one that protects you against breast cancer, bowel cancer, multiple sclerosis, diabetes, depression, and your bones. So you can see what an important molecule it is. Now the trouble is, and this is where I think a lot of the issues with people with eating disorders come in, is that normally 85% is made in the body and 15% comes from food. The problem is that's a complicated pathway. And there's a lot of enzymes in it. You've got to be able to make it properly, and you've got to have all the right nutrients that you need to do it as well. So what I think is that a lot of the people who get eating disorders don't make cholesterol properly. And so they're more dependent on food. And what we see is that when you get blood tests, and we'll talk a lot more about blood tests in a moment, but the way blood tests work, there's a range on them that everybody thinks is the normal range, but it's actually the reference range, which is different because what they do, they take the population, find the mean, and then they go 2 standard deviations either side, so that 95% of the population fit in that range. Now the problem is, especially with younger people, these are the people who go to the laboratory to have blood tests. So there's a lot of healthy people whose bloods never even see the light of day in the reference ranges. So, you know, that's why I always say to people, if you sit on the bottom of the reference range, it's probably not a good place to be. You know, I don't think anyone with an eating disorder would be happy with 51% in all their exams. And that's kind of what they're doing there. That's why we've got to get the sort of, you know, good values of everything. Now, the interesting thing about cholesterol in people with eating disorders is that I did some research a few years ago, and instead of a graph like that, we actually got one like that. So that almost 25% of the people with eating disorders had a really high cholesterol, and 25% had a really low one. The interesting thing beyond that, though, is that these ones with the really high one are the ones who are breaking down all their cell walls. Because obviously if the cell walls are made of cholesterol and you're losing weight and breaking them down, it's going to read high in the blood. But as those people with high cholesterol get better, their cholesterol goes from high back to low. And so really, it seems to me that most people with eating disorders have issues getting enough cholesterol. And really, that full cream dairy and eggs are really critical. I've seen a lot of people who developed their eating disorder when they tried to go low fat. In fact, I saw a patient a few years ago who came from a dairy farm, and all her life she'd had full cream dairy straight from the cow. But she moved into a share house with other friends from university, and they'd say, "How could you drink all that fat?" So she stopped drinking the full cream milk, and 6 months later she was in hospital with her anorexia because she had the chemistry that needs cholesterol. So at least now with the Heart Foundation coming out with these guidelines, so a few years behind the US and England, and a lot of years behind when the data started coming out, then we can have people eating cholesterol again. And these are the people where it's most important. There's a laboratory in the US who've done a lot of research on low cholesterol. And the lowest cholesterol ever recorded was in a serial killer. And it links with aggression, violence, depression, suicide, all kinds of problems, and increased risk of cancer, all related to the low cholesterol, which hasn't really been a focus in the literature because people were so worried about the high levels. And it's not that there aren't some people with high cholesterol whose body makes too much. So it doesn't mean that nobody should be on medications for cholesterol, because if your body's making too much, maybe you do need medications, and you certainly don't need lots of cholesterol-rich food. But everything in medicine, some people make too much, some people don't make enough. And you've got to work out what's right for your body to be healthy. And that's the secret of being healthy in old age. If you work out what your body needs and what you need to eat, then when you get to 90, you'll be the healthy one, not the one in the nursing home. So that's the mission, working out exactly what you need. Because otherwise, if you're not eating what you need, the body's suffering. And a lot of the chemistry of eating disorders is actually the same as aging. So that if you look at the biochemistry of somebody with an eating disorder, it's like old age. They get, accelerated aging. They're a couple of decades ahead in age-related degeneration than the normal population. Because it's logical. If your body only has enough food to do the essential things, it doesn't do the repair. So it's like having a house and only paying the mortgage and not doing any of the maintenance. So what happens is all their cells, their mitochondria, their energy, everything deteriorates quickly. But the good thing is it is all reversible with food, because that's where the nutrients are. So the really important thing for people with eating disorders is to get the nutrition they need.
So can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So where do you get the information on the right levels? I can go back years, and I was involved in natural health, and the Australian Medical Association said we need so much protein. Yet all of the natural therapy research showed you didn't need anywhere near that amount of protein, and in fact that amount of protein was damaging to the body. So where should one look to go, okay, because in my mind, I can't trust everything that the Australian Medical Association put out, because here's a classic example that they're learning on the run as to what is.
And see, it varies. That's why you've got to look at each person's bloods, and you can see how much body, for protein, if the body's losing a lot of protein, if you're able to lose a lot of protein, then you're obviously getting enough. Whereas if the body's sparing protein and hanging on to it, you need more. And the trouble is with the people with the eating disorder, they're not very good at making a lot of things because of the sensitive chemistry. They make terrible vegans. And that's... The problem is that there's pathways that are really important that need meat and fish and eggs. And if you've got sensitive chemistry, you can't do without those foods.
So individual.
It's really individual. So you've got to look at where your body is. Yeah. Otherwise you get all these problems, particularly with mental health. I've read somewhere once that people with mental health issues really shouldn't be less than pescatarian because they need some of those amino acids. And it just depends. You see, some people are able to synthesize a lot of the proteins and other people can't. It all depends on their genes, and that's what's going to come out in the next, give it another 5 or 10 years, and then you'll be able to look at it. And probably they reckon babies will come with a set of instructions. They'll do the genome and then they'll match off all the foods they need to eat, and that will give optimum health. But we're not quite there yet, but we can guess it from the individual's blood tests and everything. Yeah. Serotonin, just while we're on food, serotonin is the chemical that makes you feel good. And I'm sure you probably all already know, but one nerve releases little bundles of serotonin that bind to receptors, and that balances your mood. Now, antidepressants recycle it. which is why they often don't work in eating disorders, particularly in anorexia, because if there's no serotonin to recycle, the medication can't do what it needs to do, because it doesn't create serotonin, it just blocks it being destroyed. So what we've got to do, and another reason why eating disorders get so complex, is you've got to make serotonin. And once again, it comes from food. Tryptophan is in turkey, peas, and warm milk. And then you need iron. You know, when I say you can't be vegan, there are some alternatives, but you've got to eat a lot and you've got to absorb really well. So so you can have the peas well, you can't have the milk as a vegan, but you can find, there are some foods, it's just what we've got to do. Iron, calcium, vitamin C and folate, and then zinc and B6. So iron's in red meat, calcium in dairy, vitamin C fruit, folate in leafy green vegetables, zinc, we already know. Zinc's actually one of the most important minerals in the body. It's in 300 reactions. Oysters, pumpkin seeds. And the interesting thing is the number one symptom of zinc deficiency is actually anorexia. So you lose your appetite when you're low in zinc. You also, to actually digest, so to get the tryptophan from the food in your stomach, actually need zinc and B1 to make your stomach acid. B6 is in beer nuts and salmon. Then the serotonin turns into melatonin, which needs magnesium, which is in cocoa and eggs. But if you don't have enough B vitamins, it's more important to your body to stay alive than to feel good. So if you haven't got enough of the Bs, which are energy and keep everything going, there's a pathway to actually steal the serotonin to make B3, and it takes 60 serotonin to make a B3. So that siphons a huge amount out. When they discovered niacin deficiency in the US, they were actually able to release 100,000 chronic patients from psychiatric hospitals, because the way they were refining grain at that time was taking all the B3 out of the foods. So that's niacin, which is in almonds. The other thing about this is that obviously we need to make serotonin in the brain. So it's got to get across a thing called the blood-brain barrier, which is a membrane protecting the brain from toxins. And that needs carbs. And tryptophan is actually the hardest amino acid to get into the brain. There's 18 amino acids. It's the most difficult and needs the carbs. And that's why low-carb diets always have a mental health warning on them in the fine print. And it always says, if you have a history of depression, see your doctor before this diet. What happens if you're low on serotonin? You crave carbs, because your brain logically thinks, well, there must be tryptophan, so all I needed to do is eat carbs. And that's part of the drive in bulimia. You know, if you think about it, when people binge, nobody binges on frozen peas. Although I've been trying to get a patient to experiment on this nobody's taken me up on the challenge. I believe if you binged on frozen peas, you would get tryptophan and carbohydrate in the same food, which would actually help the pathway and you would feel better. But people tend to binge on carbs. And that's because the brain forgot that it also needed the tryptophan. So it's a bit of a sort of unfortunate signal that it doesn't go for both. Oh, there we are, thanks. Yeah. And obviously with this pathway, every pathway in the body, for every reaction, you get one of three types of enzyme. There's the wild enzyme, which is, and this is what the genes code for. So the wild enzyme is the commonest one. Then you can get a better or a worse. And if you get a better one, you live to be 110. And if you get a worse one, you get problems like eating disorders or other issues. And so what we've got to do is things like all those things we were looking at, like the folate has to be activated. And if you've got a gene where you don't activate the folate properly, you're going to be more sensitive. So all these different things that we're finding out now are helping people to recover, so that if you can't activate your folate, you can even get fancy vitamins now with the active folate. But that's not the simple solution, because you need all the other nutrients as well. Yeah. Right. So, that's a beginning where we've got to kind of get all these foods and get the person eating what they need. The problem is, by the time somebody presents with their eating disorder, they might be eating some of these foods, but their stomach feels terrible. They don't feel like eating, so they've lost their appetite. They feel bloated whenever they eat. And so even when they start eating, they don't magically get better. And I did see a really good thing once in a talk that I was listening to, where I always said to people that getting better from an eating disorder is like that, but you get there in the end. And then the person who was giving this talk did it really well, and they said that people think they'll do that, make the decision and then recover. But this person said you actually make the decision, then you go, and then you recover. And I think they were actually right. But there's all these medical things that make this hard. So, I can say to somebody, these are all the foods you need to eat. And, they'll work with their psychologist, their dietitian, everybody, and try and do it. But then they feel actually worse because their stomach isn't used to digesting. And the problem is, the gut's one of the most important organs in the body, but the least considered. And one of the things, before you're born, the size of things in a fetus is relative to how important it is after you're born. So when you get a little embryo, it's got a big head and a little tail. And then as it develops, it has a big head, a little tail, and it gets a big sac outside where all the gastrointestinal system develops. So that's where your gut actually starts off in a sac outside, then it comes back in, because there isn't room for how important it is. So we've got all these tissues, and actually, same relative thing, you've got a tiny little arm and then a really big hand, because the hand's more important. So what we've got to do is look after the nutrition to the gut. It actually needs 30% of your calories to look after the gut. But the trouble is, the body's got different priorities, and it's looking after the ovaries and testes first, then the brain, the kidneys, the heart, all the things to keep you actually alive, but it forgets about the gut. And when you're starving, there's been a lot of information about the microbiome. Every medical journal at the moment is full of articles about how the microbiome affects your health. The problem is, if the gut's needing 30% of your calories and then you're starving, the good bacteria die first. So basically you have all your good bacteria dying, and you're left with the more toxic ones that I say to people are like the gut equivalent of cockroaches. And so then when you eat, they produce more gas, you get more bloated. So we've got to try, it's like trying to reset up a saltwater aquarium, and you've got to get everything just right. So you've got your stomach, and then in the intestine, where you actually absorb, you've got little folds called villi that then have little tentacles on them. And then there's a layer of mucus, and then living in there are all the good bacteria. And so we've got to re-establish this so that your body can actually cope with food. And with people who are vomiting in bulimia, every time they vomit, it's like a tidal wave washing away all the little corals and all the seaweed and everything trying to grow in the rock pool. So we've got to try and put all this back too, partly by food. Probiotics can help. It just, it's a matter of trying to get this whole environment right again. Another thing that makes the bloating worse is the gallbladder.
I'll leave you with it, because obviously I'm
that's all right. No, that's all right. That's okay. That's all right. That's all right. Here we are. Yeah, so when we look at the digestion, after the food comes through the stomach, it needs to get some bile, which is basically the detergent, to help you digest it. And what we've got is we've got the liver up under the ribs, and then right nearby is the gallbladder. So the liver is a factory, it detoxifies, and it also produces bile. It packages up the food too to go around the body, but the bile is detergent. So when you eat, the food comes through your stomach and then into the duodenum, and then the gallbladder squirts in the bile. But when you've been starving, your gallbladder's stopped working. And so that's why often when we see people, their gallbladder, instead of being neatly tucked up under the liver, it's actually distended and swollen. And when they eat, they feel sick because the gallbladder's not emptying. But the simple solution for that is 2 tablespoons of stewed apple. With meals. And what that does is draw the bile through from the gallbladder so you can digest better. That's why everybody has applesauce on pork, because it needs a bit of extra bile to help you digest. And so centuries ago they worked out if you ate apple with it, it was better for digestion. And that's why. So the apple's good, yeah.
What happens if you don't have a gallbladder?
Then basically, when they take your gallbladder out, then the little duct that comes from the liver into the gallbladder gets diverted straight into the intestine. So basically it's like washing up with no-name washing up detergent, because it hasn't been concentrated. The gallbladder concentrates it. So you've got a milder version of bile, and it's dripping through all the time. It's lost its regulation.
And
so
stewed apple still good?
Stewed apple still helps, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
That's right.
So, Leanne, is it also why apple cider vinegar is recommended?
The apple cider vinegar is actually back a step in the stomach where you need hydrochloric acid. And like I said, that you need zinc and B1 to make the hydrochloric acid for the cells that make the acid. Now the problem is that often people with eating disorders have a lot of issues with reflux, burning, stomach ulcers, and get put on medications that block their acid. You know, things like Zantac and Nexium and Losec, all those reduce your acid. And you might not, if you haven't got the zinc and the thiamine, you're not going to make it either. And so that's why we need to build up the acid. Yeah. But the apple cider vinegar helps break down the food. So you're basically putting in a bit of acid. You can do the same thing by marinating food before you cook it, or by slow cooking makes it easier to break down. Because that's one of the problems. You need protein, but it's harder to break down. You know, it's easier to digest food that is a lot gentler than that. So it's much easier to break down a carbohydrate than a protein. Yeah. Yeah. Things like bone broth, some of those things are good because the nutrients are actually in solution and easier to digest. And then things, that you can have fermented foods. You've got to try and get the right bacteria. If you've got the appendix, your body should have the source, because the appendix is basically the world seed bank for your gut. So when all the bacteria die, if you've still got your appendix, hopefully it can reseed. But you've got to make sure that you try and sort of re-equilibrate things. Yogurt's good, and then if you have full cream yogurt, then you're also getting some cholesterol as well, which is ranitidine. That will actually remove the acid. It'll cut down the acid in the stomach. So before we're able to stop them vomiting, we can reduce the medical risks by at least not having it so acidic. So then when they vomit, they're not going to lose so much. It's not the treatment goal, but it's a step along the way so people can get better. So they're not in hospital needing potassium drips and things all the time. So if we give them ranitidine, that will actually reduce how much they're losing, and then they're more likely to be medically stable. We can also give potassium supplements, but sometimes it becomes difficult to get enough potassium in for what's being lost through the kidney. So you can sort of be chasing that way. The thing about the potassium too and electrolytes, one of the risks of the eating disorder is the effects on the heart. which is obviously a huge problem because eating disorders, as you all know, have the highest mortality of any mental illness, and they've got a higher mortality than a lot of cancers because we've got a 20% 10-year mortality, which is huge, and it's usually thought to be from cardiac problems. Now, the thing with the heart, it's the time it takes to recover that gets affected most. So when we do an ECG, you've got one of the signs on the ECG is an extra wave at the end called a U wave. And that, if you've got that wave, it shows there's not enough potassium left. So that's something we can measure. And the other thing that gets long is the time for the heart to recover, which is called the QT interval. So that's the time from when the heart starts. This is the heart getting ready to contract, contracting, and then recovering. So that's the time where it's not safe for the heart to beat again. And the longer that time, the riskier it is for somebody to do exercise. So that's why they say to people not to exercise when they're really sick. Because even though the people feel they can do it, the risk is if your heart by chance, and it's all chance, it's like Russian roulette. It's like if your heart felt it needed to beat again in that window, it can short circuit and stop. And that's the problem. So that's why we keep an eye on that on the ECG. That's why actually ranitidine is a better choice for blocking the stomach acid than the Nexium or Pariet and all the drugs in those families, because those ones can also lengthen that, which makes them quite dangerous in some people. That's the same, that interval can also be affected by antidepressants. So some of the medications, and that's why if people are on medications, we need to keep an eye on that interval, particularly if the dose is going up, to watch that that's not getting too long. And it's also why I say to people, if we tell you not to, if you've got an eating disorder, it's best not to run. If you do run, you really need to take someone with you who is really good at CPR, bearing in mind that out-of-hospital survival, even in good hands, is 3%. So you don't want to have that little window when you're running. So obviously what we want to do is correct all this chemistry to make people healthy so they can do everything they want to do. And it is all, the good news, I'm sorry this probably sounds a bit like doom and gloom, but it is all reversible, it's all chemistry. So that's what we've got to fix. Yeah, actually sometimes it doesn't even have to be exercise, it can be emotion. There's a hereditary version of that condition called long QT. So this is an acquired form of a thing called long QT. And there was somebody a few years ago who actually dropped dead walking down the aisle of her wedding with long QT, because emotion can do it too. You know, children who have that condition can get into trouble at school and have a cardiac arrest, or cross-country runs or swimming carnivals. So, it is a problem in the community as well. But people who don't have the hereditary form can actually get it from their eating disorder. And so that's why they're having the ECGs, and keeping an eye on all the medical things is really important.
Before we get on to reversal,
Yeah.
do we want to have a short break?
Yeah, sure.
Do
Yeah.
people want to grab something to eat, till a cup of water, or?
Sounds good. We might talk just a little bit more about the gut from where we were. The thing that can help, other than food, is actually some probiotics. And there are actually now, with all the work on the microbiome and everything, you can get probiotics that kill the bad bacteria. So it is worth getting the stools checked to find out if you've got parasites or different things. That's right, and some probiotics commercially can actually make things worse because they're not the strains you need. And traditionally the bacteria are in the soil, and so food. So really, they're going to be in the fruits and vegetables and things if they're grown without pesticides and all those sorts of things too. So that's absolutely true. Trying to get the healthier bacteria.
Some of the minerals has been shown, the nutrient density of certain minerals is 78% lost since 1940 to now. You know, and that's research that was done back in the 40s where they measured the nutrient values, and like it might be magnesium's down 78%.
Well, that makes sense, because the thing with magnesium is that, you know, tomatoes are one of the best sources of magnesium, but the mineral gets in the fruit in the final stage of ripening. So from the soil. So if the tomato is not still on the plant when it's turning red, then it's not getting the magnesium travelling up into it. So, you know, the tomatoes picked green in the supermarket actually have next to no magnesium. And it's like the manganese in pineapple is better in canned pineapple than in fresh pineapple, because the canned ones are the ones that were they were already ripe. They were too ripe to send to market, so they've canned them. Which is an interesting subject, because the trace minerals are really important in all this. And we've already talked about zinc, and it's in 300 reactions in the body. And like I say, it's all chemistry, and sadly not many people actually do chemistry at school anymore. It's a pity, because it's such a good subject. But if you vaguely remember... Yeah, it's the best subject. But if you remember, sometimes there was a catalyst to make the chemical reaction happen, and zinc is in 300 reactions in the body. So if you don't have enough zinc, things happen but sluggishly, and that's why it makes you tired. Now, another mineral that is often... Oh, hang on. That's often low in fact, when I did a study a few years ago of all the blood tests in people with eating disorders, the most commonly low mineral was actually manganese, which is one that most people haven't even heard of. It's not magnesium, and it's only a trace mineral. You only need a tiny bit, but it's important because it balances your blood sugar. It's also for your connective tissue integrity, so the strength in all your ligaments and everything. It's also, you need it to make your neurotransmitters. Specifically dopamine. And you need it, it's the major antioxidant in the body. That's actually manganese SOD, and that's the antioxidant in your mitochondria, which are like the little battery packs in the cells. So without enough manganese, it makes things unstable. And I think the low manganese drives a lot of the issues. Firstly, the low blood sugar. And that can actually get worse when people are even eating better, because what happens, normally when you eat, your blood sugar goes up, then you release insulin, then your blood sugar drops. The normal person actually kicks it back using their stores of glycogen, which are glucose molecules, so they don't get a low sugar. But people with an eating disorder, it just keeps dropping because they haven't got the stores. They're glucose molecules stuck together, and they need cortisol to separate them. So the blood sugar keeps dropping. Now, if you don't eat again, that can get so low that you go into a coma, which is not what you want. Usually the body's got its own protective mechanism, so you actually release adrenaline to wake you up and bring your blood sugar up. So that's what's happening if you wake up sweating. And I always say to patients, if you wake up sweating, it's an emergency because you nearly went into a coma. So don't go back to sleep without having something else to eat or drink, something like a sustagen by your bed, because you don't know how many times your body can actually do that emergency save. So you don't want to then go back to sleep again and finish up in a coma. And there was a big case, I think it's too long ago now for most people to remember it, but about 10 years ago there was a case in the US where there was a woman who'd been in a chronic vegetative state for about 20 years. And the chronic vegetative state, you're actually aware, but you can't move. They're the ones on the movies that are sort of suspended from strings and they just lie there. So she'd been like that for 20 years, and her fiance asked the High Court of the US to stop feeding her. But the parents wanted her to keep being fed. But he argued, it went to the High Court, and he argued that if she hadn't woken up after 20 years, it was unlikely she was going to wake up even if they kept feeding her. So they did actually stop. But The issue is she actually went into the coma from her eating disorder. So that's why if you wake up sweating, you need to have something first. Obviously, we'd rather you didn't even try once for your emergency save mechanism. So it's much better to eat what the dietitians tell you to, which is the 3 meals and 3 snacks. So breakfast, morning tea, lunch, afternoon tea, dinner and supper. But even doing that, there's still another 12, there's a long time. It might be 9 or 12 hours between supper and breakfast. So sometimes I find people actually have to wake up and if they're waking up every night at 2 a.m. sweating, then they need to set an alarm for 1 a.m. and have a meal or have something to eat. I had one girl who didn't want to go to hospital and she finished up having 2 boiled eggs at 2 a.m. every night. I didn't know I could not eat boiled eggs at 2 a.m., but she really didn't want to go to hospital. So we want to try and keep that sugar stable so you don't get those low drops. And the low manganese and zinc actually contribute to that drop. Because one of the things low zinc does is make you super sensitive to insulin. So that it's not only falling, but it's falling quicker than the average person. So the best so zinc, like we said before, oysters, not many people go for them, but they've got 100 times more zinc than any other food. Or the pumpkin seeds, nuts, and sometimes there is a place for supplements as well. And obviously foods are better than supplements, but just to kickstart things. And one of my favourite supplements is actually, it's just a simple Nature's Own. It used to be in Coles supermarkets. It's a bit hard to find because I suspect they found that if people took that, they didn't need to buy all the other stuff. So most chemists don't stock it anymore. They want you to buy all the separate ones, but it's Nature's Own and it's zinc, magnesium and B6. And you take 2 twice a day. And if you remember that serotonin pathway, that was the bottom 3 things in that pathway. So it was giving you that. You've got the zinc, to hit all the chemical reactions. It hasn't got, so if you have that with a pineapple juice is a good start. The other thing everybody needs to take is the thiamine, and that's the one, that the doctors will put you on. If you're in hospital, you get injections of thiamine. Thiamine is actually vitamin B1. And what it helps stabilise the heart. Basically what it does, when we were talking about magnesium before, and magnesium relaxes muscles, but for magnesium to go in and out through the cell walls, it goes through little channels, and the magnesium channels are opened and shut by the thiamine. So if you don't have the thiamine, then your channels don't open, so the magnesium doesn't do what it needs. And that's why thiamine's actually good for people who have cramps. If they take magnesium and they still have the cramps, it means the magnesium's not doing what it needs, so some thiamine. But you need this because don't forget the heart is a big muscle. And so anything that affects muscles is going to affect the heart.
What would be the best sources of thiamine?
Seafood, actually. Yeah, wheat germs, another good one.
Earlier you talked about manganese, but I think you said that the zinc was in good supply in oysters, but you didn't say where the manganese.
Oh, sorry, pineapple juice, particularly. There is some manganese in oysters too, but pineapple juice is the best. Mung bean sprouts and cinnamon is a really good source. Yeah. The interesting thing is a lot of people who actually do get eating disorders liked these foods before they ever got sick. And if you look at their families, their parents like these foods because basically in a normal state, people eat what they need to be healthy. It's just that we've turned off a lot of the signals and there's been so many messages and things that, we've kind of forgotten that. Now, while we're on the subject of all these minerals, bones are a huge problem too. And I'm sorry, I know we're talking about all the negative things, but remember there's an antidote for everything, so don't despair, you can correct it all. And finish up being the healthiest 90-year-old. Right. Okay, what we're trying to do, basically, we're trying to get strong bones. And to do that, we've got to get calcium from the blood to the bones. the complicated part is that often if you get a calcium test from your doctor, you might find the calcium's high, so people think, oh no, I'm eating too much calcium. But the problem is that's not what they're doing really. What they're doing is the calcium's not going to the bones where it needs to be, and that needs vitamin D. The vitamin D needs vitamin K2, which is in brie, butter and Gouda. You can see why low fat has been really bad for people with eating disorders, because without the fat-soluble, and vitamin D is fat-soluble as well, so is vitamin A, which is the one for your vision. A, D, E, and K. So A is vision, and your immune system, and skin. D we talked about before, the anti-cancer and everything. E, circulation. And K, there's K1, which is clotting, and K2 basically activates the D and the A. So if you don't have the fat, you don't have your fat-soluble vitamins. Actually, when they got Jamie Oliver to do the diets for the daycares in England, they actually started to see rickets again. Rickets is where vitamin D you need for the strengthening the bones. So if young children don't get enough vitamin D, their bones are soft and they actually bow. So they had all these children suddenly getting rickets, and they couldn't work out why, but basically he'd put the daycare toddlers on a low-fat diet. And so this is what's happening again, because if people don't have the fat, then they don't have the vitamins they need. So we need the D, and the D is the sun turning your cholesterol to D. Then we need manganese, magnesium, which is cocoa and eggs, and we need boron, which is in almonds. Now, if you don't have that happening, this calcium in the arteries is not a good thing to have, and because the risk is that will deposit in the walls, and that becomes a focus for plaque. The other thing that happens is that those walls, if they're if you can imagine, if you've got calcium depositing, you can actually have brittle walls and they can split. So I've got a patient who a few years ago had a heart attack from a dissecting aneurysm in the heart. Basically the walls of the heart, she recovered well, but the walls of the heart, of the blood vessels in the heart, split open, and probably she's got very calcified vessels, and so, you know, it may be that that calcium actually caused the problem. But it doesn't mean don't stop the calcium, just make sure it goes where it needs to be. The absolute, if your pulse is less than 40, or your temperature's under 35.5, I would call an ambulance. There's other reasons I would call an ambulance too, but they're the two commonest, right? Because you reach a point where the risks are too great. And what I say to people, it's like being at the top of a waterfall and you're in the whitewater rapids, and the problem is the body's designed to cope. And so with all things, it's like smoking, lung disease, all sorts of diseases, basically asthma. Your body copes and copes even as things drop. There's not a lot of difference. And so you really don't feel sick and you don't think you're doing any harm. But it's a Z shape and you go like that. And so the problem is a lot of people with eating disorders are sitting in this whitewater rapid region and they feel fine, but they're on the brink of something destabilising them. And so the problem is they're just hanging onto a rock, trying to survive there, when what we've got to do is get up to where it's safer. And that's the big issue, because if somebody who's sitting there gets the flu or gets any infection, the trouble is, like we said before, if your adrenal already isn't functioning as well as it should, and then you get an infection, you can get an awful lot sicker than the rest of the people. And that's why you can qualify for a free flu shot and pneumococcal vaccine under the same criteria as the over 65s, because you're considered at the same risk. which, and as you know, the government wouldn't give free vaccines if they didn't think that that was, you know, the risk was that much higher. So what we've got to do is, it's hard work staying there. So we've got to try and boost things and basically reverse the chemistry so that we can repair all the damage that's happened.
You were saying with the getting the calcium from the blood into the bone, how butter and Gouda and brie were good.
Yeah.
What if somebody seems to be quite sensitive to dairy and it gives them really runny bowels?
One of the things you've got to do first is make sure, you've got to check, you need to make sure they haven't got a medical problem with the bowels, like inflammatory bowel disease, and especially celiac disease. There's a very high rate of celiac disease in people with eating disorders. And even it might be, you know, because 40% of the Anglo-Saxon population have the gene for celiac disease. And then the thing is whether it gets expressed or not. Now there's actually literature both ways. So some people actually get celiac disease and then it doesn't get tested, and so they continue on being treated for their eating disorder, and in fact it was the celiac disease. So it's something that does need to be checked. And you've also got the blood test we've got for celiac disease depends on eating enough wheat. So if you do the blood test at the beginning, the person's probably not having gluten at that time, so you might need to repeat it later. And just check, you've got to check two things, their IgA and their celiac antibodies, just to make sure they haven't got celiac disease. But they can have other inflammatory problems, they can have infection, so you've got to check for that too. But the other thing is a lot of people who can't tolerate normal milk can tolerate A2, because A2 is the original protein in the milk. The French cows are all A2. And then there was a mutation where you got some A1 protein, and those cows gave more milk, so they were selectively bred as the cows of choice. And so the regular milk in the supermarket is about, you know, half A1, half A2. So if you buy the pure A2, you may find you don't have the issues. The other thing is it could be a lactose intolerance, in which case you can either get lactose-free milk or you can buy little tablets of lactase, which is the enzyme to break down the dairy. So there's ways around it, because you want to try, especially if you've got low cholesterol, because you're trying to get cholesterol, and it's that and eggs. On that subject, some people with eating disorders, I think about 20 or 30% can't tolerate too many eggs. And that's because of their metabolism. It's to do with the sulfur in it. If you have more foods with molybdenum, it makes it a bit easier. But some people, and there's also a high rate of anaphylaxis in people with eating disorders. So if people feel sick or vomit when they eat eggs, it's probably allergy, it's probably not the eating disorder. So I'd always take those particularly eggs, really seriously. One time I looked at the percentages and I had 10% of the patients out of about 70 patients with eating disorder, 10% of them had EpiPen carrying anaphylaxis, which means they had to have seen a specialist and been checked. And so if 10% had that extreme level of allergy, there's going to be a lot with lower levels. So, you know, there certainly are allergy issues. But one of the things about allergies is the health of your gut. So when the gut's healthy, it's like a high jump bar and the bar gets high, so you don't react to things. Whereas when the gut's really damaged and unhealthy, you react to everything. So a lot of it is gut health. So it's not really worth going off and spending a fortune getting all the allergy tests done and getting a list of thousands of foods you can't eat. Because really what you want to do is restore the health of the gut and then see what you can tolerate. But as I say, eggs are something that are difficult for some people, so the dairy is often a really important option. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm quite new to this. I'm just curious, like, how often are blood tests to be had in order to know what someone's levels are?
I love doing blood tests. I do them all the time. Yeah, I would. When somebody's sick, I would do them every week. But simple ones. You don't do all the blood tests all the time. I think at the beginning it's really good to get the minerals, to get a really full check, because you've got to make sure, in the beginning too, you want a proper medical check where you've got to check that there's no medical problem that's causing the anorexia, weight loss. You might have, a major heart problem, and the heart, is, not functioning properly, and your anorexia is secondary to another disease. It could be secondary to a cancer. There's all sorts of things that make you lose your appetite. So you've got to have been checked first to make sure it's not a secondary problem from some other medical condition. And then you want to check the minerals, you want to check for celiac disease. Yeah. Check your vitamin B12 and folate, and they're ones we've sort of touched on before. They're really important. They're the reason I said that people with eating disorders aren't often suitable vegans. Because and often, the interesting thing is in all the studies on the bloods of people with eating disorders, B12 and folate tend to be high, not low. Now, B12 is in meat, fish and eggs. And I do not know a single patient with an eating disorder that is living on meat, fish and eggs to cause them to have that high level of B12. And they've often got a high folate as well. But the issue is how they're actually used in the body and how many other nutrients you need to use your B12 and folate. And so we can measure that. You measure a thing called homocysteine, which is a protein that's actually, it's meant to be a transition molecule. That shouldn't be high in the blood. And in fact, high levels of homocysteine link with dementia, heart disease, blood clots and miscarriage. Now, but like I said, it's meant to be being used, so it goes two ways. It comes around one way and makes methionine, which then makes the enzymes you need to make your neurotransmitters, your hormones, and your phospholipids, which is what all the cell membranes are made of. Or it makes another thing called glutathione, which is your detoxification molecule. So if you've got high levels of this, and you've got high B12 and high folate, it's because you haven't got all the things you need. So to actually turn that into that, like I said, it's lots of chemistry. You need folate, and you need B12, and you need my favourite, zinc, magnesium, B6, you need B2, you need magnesium. So you can see why you might suddenly get the high B12 and folate, because they're sitting there, but you're not actually using them. So what we've got to do is get all the other things in as well. And every step, that's a whole series of reactions. Every reaction's coded by an enzyme. The one that people talk about quite a lot is the one that activates folate. So that's the one someone was asking me before about the MTHFR. And that turns your normal folate into the active folate, which is the one that actually works in this pathway. So that's called MTHFR. And if you get a double mutation, everybody gets either a good one or a bad one from each parent. If you get two bad ones, then only 20 or 30% of your folate actually gets through the pathway, which is okay. It's quite a common problem, and it's fine as long as you eat normally. But if you don't eat well and you don't have all these other minerals and things, then you run into troubles. And so it's really important to look at, to measure these as well and see. And we can check. The only trouble with homocysteine, it's a fasting blood test. And I don't really like getting people to fast for their blood tests, but you can do it just before breakfast. And the goal on that is to keep it under 9. It's actually a measure of aging as well, because it causes toxic damage to your blood vessels if it builds up. But it's essential as well. Homocysteine can be too low if you're not eating enough protein. If you've got that mutation, you can buy vitamins that have active folate, But you've got to be really careful because that's a bit like rocket fuel. They're very potent. But the problem is if you give somebody that and they haven't got everything else, you might over sort of stimulate the whole pathway, and that can cause issues as well. So you've got to do everything really carefully. And food's always the best solution. You know, you can turn that folates in leafy green vegetables. One thing though, people with that gene mutation don't tolerate the vitamin supplements with folic acid very well. So if you take B vitamins and they make you feel worse, it's probably that you can't tolerate the folic acid.
And what about just entry into hospital in the emergency department?
Yes.
And giving just some direction to the conversations around maybe we should look at this or test for that, because often the blood tests that they do there or the measures they take aren't really reflective of what you would do with eating disorders.
We talk a lot about the energy. This is why if these things aren't working properly, people have no energy. But phosphate is the P in ATP, which is the energy in your mitochondria. And phosphate can be low, particularly during refeeding, usually on the bloods. And people often go to emergency and say, oh, my bloods were all normal. And partly that's because the body's really good at making things look normal. So the cells actually sacrifice everything to keep the blood looking good. So you can go into emergency and come out with a clean bill of health sometimes. But if things are really bad, if phosphate's low, potassium's low, the life-threatening things will show most likely, and if you go away from it, if you get sent home and you feel bad, you need to go back. So never not go back to emergency just because you were there the day before or anything. It's better to go too many times than not enough. But phosphate tends to fall in refeeding. So even when you make the decision and think, oh great, I'm going to eat all these things, I'm going to recover really quickly, the only time I've ever actually seen someone seriously sick with refeeding syndrome was actually somebody who she was going to come, I hadn't even seen her as a patient, she was going to come and see me. And then a couple of weeks before that, she had an ear infection and saw a local doctor or a doctor in a clinic who said, if you don't eat, you're going to die. And so she started eating. And so she ate masses of food, and the day she was meant to come to the appointment to see me, her mother rang and said she was covered in bruises and her legs were all swollen. And so I said, I'd better go to hospital instead. And what had happened was she had literally started eating, huge amounts of food right through day and night, and it was too much food. One of the things that happens is the phosphate falls because you start mobilizing, you start turning on energy. In the eating disorder, like a bear that's asleep, it's like a factory where you've shut down most of the machines. You actually turned off, if you haven't got enough power to run the whole place, you turn most of the machines off. And so your body turns off most of its things. It just keeps the essential things running. And then when you start eating, it thinks, oh great, let's open everything up again. But it might be too quick, so you can actually get worse in the first, and which is really disappointing for people when they make this big effort and start eating, and then they come back the next week and things are worse, and I send them to hospital anyway. Sometimes, but it's because it can be dangerous in that first few weeks, and particularly with the blood sugar and all these other things. So emergency is going to check the life-threatening short-term things. And it's, like I say, it's always better to go than not to go. But it's in the long term, you're going to get the other things checked, the minerals, and try and get your whole chemistry right again. Phosphate is in dates and dairy. I usually like people to take a supplement of phosphate early on, particularly if there's a risk of refeeding, because at least then we've got some control of it. But phosphate is super expensive. It's $1 a tablet. Yeah, it's not on the PBS. There's no listing for eating disorders on the PBS. But if you need it, you need it, and it is really important. Yeah.
Leanne, what about the alternate supplement to resource that Mary Lawson Redhouse have been working on herself?
That's a really good supplement. Mary's trying really hard to get a supplement with a whole lot of the foods, she actually has taken all the things I've told you to eat and brewed it into a supplement drink that's being commercially, she's been doing a lot of fundraising and working with a law firm in the city actually, who have helped subsidise her to produce this supplement drink that's got a lot of natural sources of nutrients in them. Because obviously, people don't really like the current supplement drinks that we've got, like Sustagen and everything, but they're better than nothing. At least they're giving the calories and they're giving the basic nutrition. But in the longer term, we need all the nutrients. We want to get 100%. Yep.
Would you consider making a hydrolyzed protein version for people with allergies?
Oh, she's got an allergy version.
She does?
Yeah, no, she's working on it. Yes, there's an allergy one and a non.
So is it on the market yet? Or
No, they're still working on it. Yeah, still working. Yeah, we did have some samples. Not today, but yeah. Yeah, she's had some made, yeah. But it had molasses in it and green banana flour. There's a lot of good sources of these foods.
Mary's parents were here today, dropped off 2 chooks that Mary can look after.
Oh, right.
She's moving house. But they said they're getting closer, so...
Oh, that's great, yeah.
We're partnering with them as well on that. So as soon as it's released, then we can pump it out through the endED channels as well.
Yeah, no, that sounds great, because she's put in all these trace minerals, all these rare things, in a form that's going to be easier to absorb as well. Yeah, so hopefully, yeah.
So when the child goes to the hospital and they put the tube up the nose and put that bag on the stuff that's in that bag is limited of nutrients.
It's got that's a sort of rescue remedy. So it's giving them what they need to get back. It's giving them calories. It's giving them the basic nutrition. But in the longer term, they need to get all the rest of the nutrition, because the trouble is, historically, when we refeed them, they then go home and lose all that weight. It's not a long-term solution. You've got to get the food, you've got to get all the nutrients they need, and because the body was different in the beginning. Their chemistry was different, and they need all the things they need. Yeah. Yeah.
With regard to the gut biome, you've talked about how important it is, and I'm wondering if there are simple ways or if there are medical ways to just find out whether your gut biome is healthy or not very healthy and what's missing.
There's a basic, I always start with what you can get on Medicare, and you can get a stool culture, which will pick up 5 parasites and 5 bacteria, the common ones, and it'll pick up, it's a reasonable screen. You can screen for a toxin for Clostridia, which is one of the nasty bacteria. And, that's a basic check. If that shows something, then you can treat that. The problem is there's an awful lot of other bacteria, and it's often the balance between them. And the work's still coming through, and at the moment the tests beyond that are really expensive. You can get your whole microbiome mapped, and it comes out, actually UQ have set up a company that's doing that at the moment, and you can get a map of the whole thing. The problem is we don't quite know really what it means. It's probably not, you want to look at best use of money. And, I think it will be useful once we know more about it. And it might be useful. There's another test that you can send off to the US where they actually look at acids being produced by bacteria. And that picks up some of the other strains of bacteria. There's a whole lot of sort of emerging things around the world, and that's the one that give it 5 or 10 years and they'll become more mainstream. Or if we can start doing a bit more research onto it, because the trouble is that to get the evidence for medicine and all the evidence-based that we need, you've got to have the research, and it's just a little bit slow because those tests are expensive. That's the problem. They're about, the urine test that goes to the US is $350 US. But it can be very useful, because I think that's actually, because it actually shows you what acids are being produced that may be affecting the function. And there's some really interesting work on one of those that actually, to turn your dopamine into noradrenaline, which both of these are neurotransmitters, and particularly mixed up in some of the addictions, motivation, energy, this enzyme is actually blocked by a thing called HPHPA, which is produced by certain strains of Clostridia. And there's really interesting work coming from the US at the moment on that. It just takes a little while. But, you know, medicine recognised long ago that bacterial infections can cause psychiatric side effects. There's a thing called PANDAS where you get anorexia after a strep throat. And even recently in the news, there was a boy with schizophrenia who was treated with all antipsychotics and spent 2 years in and out of hospital in the US. And then a very astute physician recognised little red spots on his arm as an infection called Bartonella. And they treated him with antibiotics for that bacteria, and his schizophrenia was cured within a week. And that's where these bacteria are actually producing substances that affect the chemistry. So I think, you know, I think there's a lot more we can do, and the evidence is slow to come through, but it's coming. Yeah.
When are you going to open up here? I'll put you on the spot.
I am visiting my 2 little granddaughters nearby after this. Yeah.
They told me they're missing you.
Yeah.
Do you have any particular constituents of your diet that you eat each week to look after your gut biome? Or is there a particular probiotic that you would recommend as a sort of a rule of thumb? This is the place to start.
I've got a couple. If you do the basic test and you've got parasites on it, and you might treat them, depends how sick the person is, you might treat them with antibiotics, but then I would give, there's a probiotic called S-bifidobiotic that basically has a good strain of a fungus and a good bacteria. Basically it's a killer bacteria, it kills off the bad ones. And so 1 a day of that is a good start, if you've got them. If you want to be gentler, because the trouble is if you start killing off whole, huge numbers of bad bacteria, you can actually get a thing called the Herxheimer effect, where the toxins from the dead bacteria cause aches and pains, and they can actually make you worse. And if you've got a patient who's really fragile, you've got to be really careful about that. So, that's something you can do. But there's Multigen, and these are made by a company based from Brisbane called Bioconcepts. And the brand is actually Orthoplex. Multigen is a gentler version of that, and it's also got a strain of bacteria that works in allergies. It's the one, I don't know if you've heard, but a few years ago at the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, they were doing a study on peanut anaphylaxis and trying to reduce the reaction so that, to reduce the risk in children. And they decided to use for their placebo arm probiotics. And then they found that the people getting the placebo, as in the probiotics, weren't reacting afterwards. And that's actually at the point where 5 years after their testing, they're still not reacting to peanuts. They're still not sending them out to eat peanuts, but on the actual testing, they're not reacting. And they figure that if they got an accidental exposure, they'd be safer. And this one has a little bit of that. So this one, if somebody's got allergies, and it's got some of the killer ones, so it's a gentler version. The other probiotic my other favourite is one called NRG, and that's by MedLab. And this one is actually really close to getting a PBS listing for the treatment of depression. That's actually, that company I think the research of that company anyway, comes from an ex-professor of medicine at Sydney Uni who's done a lot of work on the gut bacteria. And what they've shown in the first studies from PA, they got people with anxiety and depression who hadn't responded to any antidepressant or any antipsychotic, because they're the ones that are allowed to be tested on, sort of the more random trials. And so they got those people, and 80% of them actually showed significant improvement on the probiotics, and the dose is 1 twice a day. And then they stopped the probiotic and their symptoms relapsed, and then they restarted it and they recovered again. So there's actually QUT's psychology are working on that trial at the moment as well. So they just need a few more trials to get the PBS listing, which would be really good. But it's actually got more than just the probiotic. It's got strains of bacteria that produce the anti-anxiety neurotransmitters. It's also got some magnesium orotate, which is useful in that pathway we were showing before with the B12 and the folate. And it's also got some coenzyme Q10, which is like the body's spark plug for energy in the mitochondria.
Are these readily available in general?
You need a prescription. And the prescription can come from a doctor, a naturopath, a dietitian. It's not a government script. It means that somebody who knew what it was prescribed it for you.
Right.
Yeah. So they're not.
Sure.
No, they'll be behind the counter. Yeah. Yeah.
I hope I'm not monopolising too much.
No, that's all right.
One more question, which is about, have you found any link between taking these supplements and easing of autoimmune problems?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, totally. And there's a high rate of autoimmune issues in people with eating disorders. But, interestingly, there's a university hospital in the US that was doing a trial for rheumatoid arthritis, and treating these bacteria with antibiotics and then probiotics is actually really useful in arthritis. Yeah.
So the NRG would rate as something that might help with autoimmune problems?
It will help, but you probably need to kill these as well, because a lot of the autoimmune is reaction to the bacteria.
So what do you do to kill that?
If you know you've got Clostridia, and that's the one that you've either got to get a positive test here, and I've only had one patient show up on the local testing, and a few people who've done this test and sent it to the US we've treated as well. And then what you do is you do 10 days of antibiotic, and then you've got to pulse it because they produce spores. It's like the gut's kind of in this situation. I think if you imagine it like a rainforest that's been overgrown with lichen and moss and all those things are sort of over everything, and that's what the gut's like with the Clostridia. And so you've got to kill the spores as well. So what you do after the 10 days, you then hit it every third day with antibiotics for 3 months. And that will kill the bacteria. Then you take the S. bifida to get the healthy bacteria back in. And some NRG for all the symptoms of the arthritis. So that combination is really good. Yeah. And like I say, the trials are coming, but it takes the average for these things to get to mainstream, to sort of everyday medicine, is about 20 years. Because there's a lot of trials that have to be had first. And that's the problem. You've got to do, but as an individual, you don't want to wait 20 years. Yeah, and it's quite safe to start with, say, the multigen, which is the gentler one, and see how that goes. Maybe, and the NRG, they've done studies on that in fibromyalgia, and with good results as well. So, NRG would be a good start, and then maybe add multigen if you haven't done the sort of testing to do that. And that might be enough, you never know. But, it's all really promising. And like I say, the medical journals are full of the microbiome, treating with different probiotics. It's just that the information is still developing. Yeah. We're still working out. There's so many strains and we only know a few. And that's why there's lots of other probiotics. I just know a few too. And these are ones that I've found help in different conditions. Yeah.
So you had a picture of the intestinal wall before, and I was just thinking, so with all this stuff, what does lactoferrin do for this stuff?
Oh, the lactoferrin, that's another of my favourite supplements. Not that I say, look, I really prefer food, and then I say, but there's this supplement and that supplement. Lactoferrin actually comes from colostrum. And what it does is resets the gut. So when a baby's born, the colostrum actually sets it up to absorb the nutrients and for the immune system. It's like my father-in-law on a farm used to always say if a calf was born and the mother died, he would always say there was no point bottle feeding the calf if you didn't give it some colostrum first, which didn't mean he let them die. It just meant that it motivated people to go and lie in the paddock and, you know, steal some colostrum from another mother giving birth, so to give to the calf so they could be fed. But without that, he said they would die of infection. And the reason they died of infection is because their immune system didn't get triggered. I did show Emily a really great picture, which I didn't bring to, actually I brought some other things, but I didn't bring that one, with all the different types of cells and how the immune system gets triggered by the damage from the bacteria and the starvation. And it's all working. The trouble is all these things are working against the poor person who's trying to recover. And so we've just got to work out what's going on and get it all right.
Yeah, so that question was sort of leading back to my dad's question about autoimmune, because what I ended up getting is I couldn't find the lactoferrin that you prescribed. I actually got something from MedLab called Immune 5, and the lactoferrin.
That's good, yeah.
And so does it, I don't know, does that like mean that lactoferrin helps with the immune system?
Yes, it does, yeah.
Then does that mean also autoimmune, or is that just like going too far?
Yeah, because autoimmune too, because autoimmune, the end stage, I went to a really great lecture on autoimmune diseases, and basically autoimmune disease is the end result of ongoing stress. You know, like I said before, physical stress, mental stress, whatever, but if your body is under ongoing stress, that's when you develop, you know, the cells change in the wall of the gut and everything, and that leads to the autoimmune condition. So it's not by accident that autoimmune disease is so common in people with eating disorders and people with, you know, psychiatric illness overall, all kinds of problems. You know, basically the end stage can be either autoimmune disease or cancer, excuse me, depending on your own body's chemistry is how it will react under those stresses. Who's done a huge amount of work on nutrition. And the reason it's so good for people with eating disorders is that it's got every nutrient, like there's vitamin D. It tells you what foods have got it, tells you all the chemical reactions it's in. And so it's a really good guide for, and it's got unusual food sources as well. So it's not that like I said before, I don't think it's the best choice to be a vegan if you've got this sensitive chemistry, but there may be ways around it if your stomach can digest enough. And you can get some of these nutrients. One thing you can't get as a vegan in Australia is B12. So you can't be a healthy vegan without supplements. You can in India because they've got different, people evolved to eat the diet where their ancestors were. Because obviously if you had the genes that needed B12 and you lived somewhere without meat, you would die. And so the people who, if you look back at your own ancestors, what they ate is probably what your genes do best with. But in India, in the third world, they have bacteria in their gut that makes B12. So they can be vegan, they make B12. They make a lot of the things we don't. And in fact, there was a big business where they were actually getting their gut bacteria and selling them for a fortune in the US. But the problem is they're killed by hygiene. And you can't sort of think, oh, well, okay, I'll stop refrigerating my food, put it all in a cupboard in the backyard, and I'll live like in, you know, third world, because the bacteria here would be so toxic that you'd actually die of gastro. So, you know, practically speaking, we haven't got the gut to be a vegan either. Not that I'm sort of recommending that it's better not to be. Pescatarian is probably the least option, you know, the least, if you're not going to have everything, then at least some fish and seafood fills in some of the gaps. But it's better to make those sort of choices from a platform of being well. If you make those choices with an eating disorder, it makes it harder because you've got to eat. It's even the difference between chicken and red meat. To get the same amount of iron, you've got to have 18 tablespoons of chicken to equal 2 tablespoons of red meat. And who's going to sit down and eat the 18 tablespoons of chicken? And so it's a lot harder. If you go with a balanced diet and try and get, you know, moderation in everything, you'll actually pick up all the nutrients. And when the body starts recovering, people will crave the foods they need. And that's a good sign because the eating disorder turns everything off. It's trying to stop the person eating what they need, and it just wants to keep them controlled. So once people start actually to feel like certain foods, then it's a really, you know, that's a good sign. They're getting better. So we've just got to keep eating.
Is cinnamon a good thing for someone to have?
Which, sorry?
Cinnamon.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Does it affect blood sugar in some way?
It helps, it improves blood sugar. Yeah, you know, in other food, I wouldn't sort of have straight cinnamon. Or, you know, I mean, I just, you know, like, yeah, I don't know what large quantities do, but yeah. Cinnamon donuts, yeah. Look, there's no food. I went to a thing once and they said you know, it was on healthy aging, and they said you can eat whatever you like, whenever you like, as long as you cook it yourself. So it's basically fresh food and, you know, sort of natural food, you know, bake your own food. So, you know, baking muffins. And that's actually, I just got this book recently called Smart Snacks, and it's actually done by a psychologist and a dietitian, and it's got snacks with all these nutrients we need to actually, you know, sort of to give you some of the nutrients you need to make the things you need. And actually the snacks are the hardest thing for people with eating disorders because snacks are so important. You know, because you've got this, yeah, have a go, yeah. Yeah, if you've got a blood sugar that falls, you've got to have the snacks as well.
Can that postural tachia actually cause weight loss if it's equivalent to running around the block? Can it make you burn?
The energy needs are greater, that's for sure. And that's part of that chemistry too. And part of the genetics is that actually you need a lot more food for the same energy. It's like, you know, it's like, I always say, it's like a boat that's sort of an old one. My brother's got a boat and my brother-in-law has a boat. And between the two, my brother's is an older one and it's really hard work. So when they're bringing it up off the beach, he has to turn it really hard. And people have to take shifts to get it up on the trailer, right? And then my brother-in-law's was a newer one, and so his you just wind, it's easy, right? Now, the person with the eating disorder is like the older boat. So it takes way more energy. So just to be able to walk around the room needs way more energy. Yeah, and that's why you've got to eat. You know, people with eating disorders look at what other people eat and think, well, I eat way more than them, so why am I in trouble? And that's why, because they need probably, you know, more than a teenage boy. You know, probably about 3 times more than average people. And that's part of the issue. Because everybody's got a picture of what a normal plate looks like, and they've all got friends who are getting away with eating a lot less, but they haven't got this chemistry. But mind you, those people who aren't getting what they need when they're younger will get other diseases in older age too. So, you know, they're not necessarily getting away with it. They just haven't got... The eating disorder is actually an early clue. If you get on top of it, you can actually be the healthiest. Yeah, because you're working out exactly what your body needs. Yeah. Yeah. So I don't mean to depress you with all the negative consequences of everything and to all leave in fear, but actually it's all reversible. And it, like I say, it's chemistry. If you eat what you need and just understand the chemistry of what's going on and then work to reverse that, then everyone can recover. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.